And it's what, in your perspective, is the most valuable idea on the planet right now?
This is where you should have given me questions in advance, Daniel, so I could like reflect on it for a week.
Right.
The most valuable idea for the planet?
On the planet right now, in your perspective. It's completely subjective.
Empathy. I feel like there's a lot of divisions, a lot of uh, tendency to see other people as not just different, but really an enemy and a threat. And I feel like if we tried a little bit harder to walk in someone else's shoes and see it from their perspective, we could avoid a lot of problems and a lot of violence.
I hope you can see the excitement on my face. I am really excited to introduce this person. The following is a conversation with Dr. Samantha Kelly, a distinguished historian and professor of history at Rutgers University, known for her deep dive into the intricacies of medieval European history and particularly focusing on Italy and the Mediterranean world. She graduated summa cum laude from Yale University, and Dr. Kelly has traversed through ancient and medieval timelines, with completing her postbachelorate studies at Harvard University to earning her PhD in medieval European history from Northwestern University under the guidance of the renowned scholar Robert E. Lerner. Her groundbreaking first book, The New Solomon, Robert of Naples, 1309 to 1343, and 14th-Century Kingship, not only won the prestigious Moraro Prize, but also reshaped our understanding of 14th-century kingship. With a career adorned with prestigious fellowships and grants, including positions at the Istituto Italiano di Studi Storici in Naples, the American Academy in Rome, and the École Française de Rome, Dr. Kelly's contributions illuminate the religion, culture, and cross-cultural exchanges of the medieval Mediterranean world in a way few can parallel. And now, dear friends, here's Dr. Samantha Kelly.
One. Awesome. Again, a pleasure to have you here. So I was hoping you could walk us through and paint sort of a picture of your early life and some of the things that might have driven you to history, but also just you as a person when you were younger.
Well, I grew up in Connecticut. I did all my early schooling in Connecticut through my BA. And honestly, I can't say that there was anything particular in that upbringing that led me to medieval history. I actually didn't study European history at all in college. It's something that I kind of stumbled across after I graduated. I went to Italy, I moved to Italy right after I graduated, and I just wanted to live there. You know, I got odd jobs. I worked in a leather factory. I taught English to Italians. But I think being there and being able to be in these spaces that were created in the Middle Ages, kind of for the first time, it brought it to life for me. And I was really interested in pursuing that. So I'd been an American Studies major as an undergraduate, so like not related at all. But I did have some European languages. I knew French. I learned Italian while I was there. I studied Spanish in college, right? So I felt like it was something that I could access, but I had no training. So I went back to the US after a year and I asked some professors. So I was sort of torn at this moment between studying ancient Christianity and studying medieval Europe, particularly religion. So I asked a professor who specialized in each, what would I need to do? I have like basically no background, and the ancient Christian specialist said, uh, you're too old to begin. You don't have any of the languages that you would need. You don't have Greek, you don't have Latin, you don't have Syriac. You don't have Hebrew, so you're 22 and it's too late, just give up. So I think rather naively, I accepted this advice. I would not now recommend that to anybody as someone who, learned a new language in her 40s. But the medievalists said, okay, this is feasible. This is what you need. You need 5 content courses in medieval history to show that you know something, and you need 2 years of Latin. So I moved to Boston, actually, where you are. And I very cleverly got a job at Harvard, which gave me free tuition. So I worked as a secretary and I took classes at night for 2 years until I had like the, dossier that this professor had promised would get me into grad school. And I did. And so from there, I went to study medieval Europe with a specialist of religious history, because that's really what I wanted to do. So that's kind of how I got into it. It wasn't so much my personal background, I guess, as a kind of intellectual, but also in some ways personal journey, right? That I really wanted to investigate this early past. And I was particularly interested in the spiritual commitments of people at a time when religion was such a big part of people's identity, but also there were very different ways that this could be expressed, right? Different interpretations, I guess I would say, of what a Christian life can look like or should look like.
Interesting. Were there any sort of, just to linger on your upbringing and sort of your interest in history at a younger age, were there any specific people that nudged you in that direction? Was it just something you sort of just found your way to? I'm sort of wondering if there were any core figures in your life that played a big role.
I would say that I came to that interest on my own.
Okay.
Um, and there was, until graduate school, I had no mentor who could lead me in that direction. Yeah.
Okay. And your thesis advisor was a pretty remarkable historian himself. Um, and so I can imagine he was a pretty incredible mentor. Can you sort of expand on some of the benefits of having as an amazing thesis advisor as you had, and some of the ways that can shape your trajectory?
Absolutely. So I'm incredibly grateful to him. We're still in contact. I consider us, close friends. And one of the things I appreciate the most is that I feel like he took a risk on me. I didn't have a lot of background. I didn't even have an undergraduate major in European history. And, lots of people come in with a master's already, and I had none of that. So he was willing to kind of invest in me. And he was a very demanding advisor. I mean, he had quite high standards. We used to joke that the first hour of seminar was spent correcting the typographical mistakes in the footnotes of the books that we read. Like, he was very, very precise, which I appreciated, because I think he was kind of an example, right? Of it takes imagination to enter into the past. I think you have to kind of try and understand what the lived experience was of people. But it's not just imagination, right? The beauty of history to me is that it's really bounded by the documents that you have, and you can't stray from those. And he was very he drilled that into us, let's say. So I really appreciated that, but also just super encouraging, right? I said, look, I want to work on heresy. I want to work on heterodox movements. I'd really like to do something in Italy because, I love it there and I speak the language. And so he helped me find a topic that I could do for my dissertation. And, he read like every draft that I produced. He always had my back. And that was crucial. Absolutely.
Right. I think very crucial. And so I understand that he focused on rigor quite a bit, and you studied Islamic history too. And I'm wondering what sort of how that plays into the broader context of medieval history. What's the importance? Because I don't know much about Islamic history. What's sort of the importance of Islamic history in the medieval era?
Well, for me, because I was working on I ended up writing my dissertation on a king of southern Italy, right, as you know, from the 14th century. So southern Italy is very connected to other places in the Mediterranean. And the rulers of southern Italy at this point, it was a French dynasty, the Angevins. They also had territories outside of Italy. They had some in France, in Provence, which was not yet part of France, but also in the Eastern Mediterranean. So part of that was me wanting to kind of understand the larger Mediterranean context. And part of it is that the Islamic tradition is another religious tradition, an intellectual tradition with lots of influence on Europe. Um, and I just felt like to have a broader, better understanding of my primary topic, I needed to know a little bit more about everything else that was going on, I guess.
Right. And so you sort of touched on this a little bit, but your doctoral dissertation sort of laid the groundwork for your future research on 14th century kingship. Can you sort of address sort of the key points of your research and what led you to do it specifically?
Oh, for my dissertation in my first
Yes.
book?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is sort of another lesson that I learned from this project. I was interested in this particular king, whose name is Robert of Anjou, because he was reputed to be the defender and supporter of a group of heretics who were called spiritual Franciscans, and they believed in absolute poverty, and they were declared heretical by the Pope. So I thought this is very interesting, right? Because we have a ruler, he's actually the vassal of the Pope, his territories butt up against the papal state, and yet he's supporting a group that the Pope has decided are heretical. So how do you negotiate that, right? Well, it turned out he wasn't a supporter of Franciscan spiritual heretics, as I discovered as I did my research. So I had to pivot, and I ended up writing about his kind of ruling strategies in general. If it wasn't this deep commitment to spiritual Franciscanism and poverty, what was it that animated his reign? And so the book ended up being a series of chapters about certainly religion, a kind of dynastic sanctity that he promoted, but also his patronage. And of course, if you patronize intellectuals, they write nice things about you. So it's also like propaganda. His policy, kind of foreign policy, and what we might call domestic and foreign, let's say his relationship with other states, his own preaching, which was pretty unusual for a king. So I just kind of tried to put that all together. It ended up being what seems like a pretty traditional topic, which is royal biography. This is not how I thought about it at all. It was really more about kind of identity formation, right? And how this king tries to create a persona that's going to work for his like very contentious and different subjects, and also his allies, his enemies or critics. So yeah, it was a little disappointing to me that I didn't get to write as much about religion or heterodoxy as I hoped to, but that's where the sources led me, and so that's where I had to go.
Right. And so this was all while you were in Italy at the time?
I
Did,
did 2 years of research in Italy writing the dissertation. Yeah, and it was basically done by the time I left.
and so can we sort of linger on some of the ways in which being in history physically sort of deepened your understanding of the history and helped in your work at the time?
Yeah, this is something I think about a lot with my students. As someone who myself wasn't really that attracted to history as an undergraduate and felt like it was kind of a dead subject, like this has all happened, it's all past, it's kind of dead, it's not so relevant to me. How do you encourage your students to think of it as like these are real people, right? As real as you and me, who faced challenges and they didn't know how it was going to work out, right? They're dealing with structural forces, but they're also making choices. And I feel like being in those spaces where they had actually lived was the first time that I felt that empathy, right? That like just visceral feeling that they were living and breathing in this same space, just like I am, maybe 500 years ago, right? And the only thing that separates us is time. So for me, it was kind of like going from seeing a movie in black and white to seeing a movie in color. And I still don't know if that's something that one person can communicate to another, or if it's something that everyone just has to maybe stumble on their own. I try, right? I definitely spend time encouraging my students to like think about our historical subjects as real people and complicated people. But yeah, I don't know if that's ultimately something you can really teach.
Right. I feel like it's sort of, I mean, you to an extent you can read the literature, but that only paints, like you said, it doesn't color it in the depth perhaps it might be necessary. Um, do you think that's something we need more of that we don't do of today as much, or is it is it something that historians more or less factor in more often than not?
Well, I would say that the most popular kind of history writing today is biography, right? And I think this is a way that people who, don't do history as a profession but are interested in it, that is how they get into it. And that is what they find most interesting, is that kind of personal connection. I think maybe academic scholars are at least equally interested in kind of structural forces. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about those. Um, Maybe that does make it a little less accessible for a general reading public. Um, Sometimes we don't have the sources to be able to flesh out individual experience. And often the individual experiences we can flesh out are the elites, right? It's the famous people, the powerful people. Um, it's not the little people. So it can take some extra creativity, I guess, or a little more digging to try and get into the lived experience of people who maybe didn't leave a lot of records of their own experience. I mean, that is something that I try to do in this book. We do have records from the Ethiopian community in Rome at Santo Stefano. They don't, I wish one of them had written, wow, this is what it's like to live in Rome. This is what I find surprising. This is how people react to me when I walk down the street. They didn't write those kinds of documents, but they did leave other kinds of documents that I think you can kind of try and put together to access what it might have been like for them living there.
Right. I mean, I can imagine that one of the benefits of being in a place while doing research, in this case, I'm taking Italy, would be, I guess, the collaboration that you can form with local historians, people who maybe might be more well attuned, and I guess as a scholar, that's a useful thing, right? Collaborating
Yes,
with people on the ground that are like,
absolutely.
or that's sort of their native heritage. That's super interesting. And yeah, so to sort of pivot a little bit into the New Solomon and 14th century kingship, what was it about this sort of the contradictory portraits of Robert by Dante and Patriarch that sort of sparked your curiosity and made you realize there was more to investigate there?
I would say that Dante and Petrarch weren't the way I got into it.
Okay.
It was the idea that he had powerful and let's say suspected religious commitments that got me into it. The fact that Dante and Petrarch both wrote portraits of him and kind of different portraits um, helped me establish that his reign was significant, that people paid attention to it, that whatever he was doing maybe had ramifications beyond his own lifetime. So that's kind of how I used it. He's not the best known ruler in medieval Europe. So one thing that I could do is say, look, Southern Italy, people don't even necessarily spend a lot of time thinking about this as one of the big kingdoms of Europe, but you know, this guy was known, and people had opinions about his ruling strategies.
Right. And, sort of reading through it, one of the things that you seem to have struggled with was finding archives with information and the details that you had hoped. I'm wondering how you I'm sure there's a methodological way of doing this in historical studies, but how did you go about doing this in specific with this book?
Yeah, that's interesting because it can be a real challenge with lots of different kinds of projects. So, as you know, I guess, because it sounds like you've been doing some reading, the archives of the Angevin dynasty in Naples were destroyed in World War II. And that's a problem. There's a lot of information we would like to know about how they just went about concretely governing that we don't have. It's being reconstructed based on other sources that have survived, but I don't think they've yet gotten to Robert's reign, and certainly they hadn't gotten to Robert's reign when I was working, whatever it was, many years ago. But in a way, it was also a blessing, because if there's an enormous archive of documents, you're going to have to wade through all of those documents, right, to have a good sense of what was actually going on. So in a way, it might have been kind of freeing. Instead of using archival documents from the Angevin government, I used mostly manuscripts. So religious treatises written by people in his court, works of art created for the dynasty and to kind of showcase the dynasty, the sermons that Robert himself gave on different subjects as a different way, let's say, that he spoke to both his subjects and his allies. So it ended up being enough sources, right? Different kinds of sources, I guess, that allowed me to look at his reign from different aspects.
Interesting. So it's sort of this coalescing of as much information as you can find. And were there records there in Italy that were at least maintained?
Yes, absolutely. A lot of them are actually in the Vatican, which is probably the main library that I've used my whole career.
Okay.
They have such an amazing collection of medieval manuscripts on like every imaginable subject. So a lot of the religious treatises actually and sermons that I was looking at, written either by Robert or members of his court, there were copies of those in the Vatican. Some were only in Naples. I did spend a year in Naples looking at documentation there. So those were the two main places that I could find the kinds of texts that I was using.
Interesting. So I think one of sort of the key findings that you mentioned was that Robert deliberately cultivated an image of divinely inspired wisdom. And I'm wondering, sort of, for a skeptic who would respond by saying, "This is just clever propaganda," um, what would your sort of historical response to that be?
Um, well, I do think it was propaganda. That is, I think it was a consciously cultivated image. But I also think that a culture deeply steeped in Christianity and that believes power comes top down, right? It comes from God, and it is bestowed on particular leaders who are responsible then for the subjects under them. I think that the idea of kind of divinely endowed wisdom would have been potentially comforting and, you know, producing confidence that the decisions he was making were justified. I think that's how he used it. I think that's how the people in his court who were writing about him and promoting his style of rule were couching it too. Because the other claim I make is that he didn't actually do much, right? I mean, he was often his strategy was to kind of sit and wait and hope that things worked themselves out. Do some talking, right? Reassure his allies. but often like not commit soldiers, not immediately go into war. He didn't have any major military undertakings, which is something that, kings were often expected to do and praised for doing. So it's not entirely novel to promote yourself as a wise king whose wisdom comes from God, but I think it did help maybe compensate for his failure to enact some of the other expectations of a medieval king in Europe.
Interesting. So, so it's definitely not a genuine political ideology. It was more of a creation, like a cinematic creation of his personality shaped by him in a way where he was consciously trying to influence the perspective that people had on him. Is that sort of
And maybe that's my more like secular, modern interpretation. I can't know if he really believed that, he came from a holy dynasty. His brother was sainted. His relative in France, King Louis IX, had been sainted. He had other relatives on the Hungarian side who were sainted. So, it's possible he did believe that he had a God-given right to rule and had been endowed with these special characteristics. He was the third son, so he was not expected to come to the throne. His eldest brother died, and his second brother basically gave up his right to the throne to become a monk and eventually saint. So possibly he did feel some sense of, this was destiny. I was chosen. I can't know that.
yeah.
It's possible, but you can certainly see that he and the people in his court did work to communicate this idea.
It's it's just fascinating to sort of also psychoanalyze somebody just given the text and try to understand what it is that was going through their mind at the time. I think that's another fascinating component of getting to do something like what you do. Um, so you sort of make a powerful case for the 14th century as an age for political experimentation that needs to be understood on its own terms and not just as a foil to the Renaissance. And I'm wondering what other academics have had in response to that sort of core idea.
Well, it's probably true that whatever period a given historian works on, they think that it's pivotal in some way, right? We invest in the time periods that we work on and the places that we work on, and part of what I think we all try to do is say, um, this is important, right? It's worth us spending some time figuring it out. Would I say I like revolutionized people's ideas that the 14th century was important? No, definitely not. The Black Plague happened in the 14th century, so I think everyone's long been aware that lots of very important stuff happened in this century. There has been more work on southern Italy in particular in the 14th century, some of it right around the time that I was writing. Carolyn Brazelius did a wonderful book that she had already started when I was writing my dissertation on architecture in Naples, and Elizabeth Castine wrote a wonderful book on Joanna of Naples, who was the successor ruler in Naples after Robert in the 14th century. So there's definitely, there's been more work done on it. But every century is important, right? Every century has something new that's happening, some trends that it's continuing.
Right. But was there anything special about the political experimentation of that century in respect to other centuries, or was that not as distinct either? There's been just as much or equal political experimentation past that century.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's probably political experimentation in every period.
Okay. So nothing. Okay. Very interesting. So have you tested out this sort of multifaceted model for examining medieval politics in other work that you've done where you sort of look at the individuals um, and look at the sort of broader historical context? And is that just a given? That's something that you do regardless as a result of historical training, or is that a different approach?
No, actually, I would say that I haven't really pursued that particular approach since that book.
Okay.
My second book was about one particular text, also produced in southern Italy, the first history of Naples that was written in the local language, in the vernacular. Um, and I liked it because it was a very different kind of project, right? Rather than like trying to take a whole bunch of different kinds of sources to illuminate one person, I was going to look at just one text, right? And trying to approach it from different angles. So I feel like that was a completely different kind of project. And then the book that I've just finished on the Ethiopian pilgrims, there's no one central figure. It's really the community of Ethiopian Orthodox at Santo Stefano as a group that I'm interested in. So I'm not following kind of one biography. I guess you could say it's a group biography. And I am interested definitely in kind of their experience as individuals when I can tease out individual information about them, about their backgrounds, about what they're doing in Rome. But also absolutely setting that in the larger context because, it's not that easy to be Ethiopian Orthodox in the capital of Christianity and capital of Catholicism in the 16th century. So how they were received, what were some of the like broader ideas about religious belonging, right? Who counts, who can be tolerated and who can't be tolerated, what use Europeans had for this Ethiopian community. All of that was stuff that I had to consider to be able to understand what their experience was like.
Right. So sort of switching gears into Ethiopia a little bit, I'm trying to understand what led you to focus. I understand your first article is a curious case of Ethiopic Chaldean, where you're trying to examine sort of the derivations of the language of Ge'ez being associated with the ancient region of Chaldea, of Chaldean, sorry. And I'm wondering what drove you to that. Was there anything about Ethiopian specific, that time that you were in life specifically, that drew you to that, or was that just sort of a random event?
Um, it's interesting that that was the first article that I ever published in this area. But I had started, that came out in 2015. So my studies of Ethiopian history started in 2012. I got this grant, as you may know, that allowed me to just go back and be a student again and kind of, develop training in a different field. So I spent a year doing that in Addis Ababa, in Hamburg, and in London. And so I'm starting from zero, right? Like I know nothing really about Ethiopian history. So I'm just reading everything that I can. I'm particularly interested in Ethiopia's relations with Europe in this period because, right, the Europe part is something that I know that's more familiar to me, and the Ethiopian part is completely new. So I'm interested in kind of, I guess, centering my research on those connections. I'm not trying to do Ethiopian history itself because that just seemed too overwhelming, too intimidating. But to just try and get a handle on these connections. And I was reading all kinds of stuff. I mean, I wish I still had my notes. My computer was actually stolen the week after I got back. So I lost everything except the draft of that one article, which luckily I had sent to a friend to read. So it was a little bit chance, actually, that was the first one that came out. It was born of me spending a lot of time, again, in the Vatican and discovering that they had like dozens of Ge'ez manuscripts that belonged to and were often copied by this community in Rome. And I had read, or I knew that this idea that Ge'ez was Chaldean, the ancient Chaldean language, was something that scholars were like, I don't really know where this came from. Everyone knows that Chaldean is Aramaic, and why is this guy saying that it's Ge'ez? And I thought I found the connection, or I thought I found the smoking gun while I was there in the Vatican. And it was sort of an easy first project to do for me in the sense that it was really a lot about the European reception, right? So that's stuff that I'm more familiar with. I don't have to go deep into the Ethiopian context. I don't have to know that much, let's say, about the Ethiopian context to do it. So that was kind of a nice baby step for me. And then from there, as you know, I kind of fanned out, right? As I learned more about Ethiopian history and the Ethiopian context, I could look at that side of it more in these articles. I'm still interested in the relationships, right? And how information is kind of communicated across cultures. But the more I read, the more I was able to kind of approach that a little more from the Ethiopian side. So like the article, Illustrations at the Council of Florence, what I'm really interested in there is who were these four monks who were brought to this ecumenical council. They have no official status, but they're being asked lots of questions. Why did they go? Why did they present Ethiopian Christianity in the way they did? And that did require much more kind of understanding of their background and the Ethiopian context. So as you probably know, my argument is that they were Eustachian monks. So when they go, they're actually not, they're tolerated, but it's not the official sanctioned practice of Ethiopian Christianity.
Right. I'm sort of curious what some of the obstacles you faced were in trying to formulate your questions, research questions around Ethiopian medieval history, and how you went about doing that. Was it sort of a clear path? You knew, okay, given this thing that I'm studying in Europe, Catholic Church is and understanding the roots of this language, you sort of just the trajectory found itself, or you were interested in specific details and couldn't help but uncover them.
I would say that from the beginning, I was interested in Santo Stefano. I was interested in this community, and I was just like amazed that there were all of these Gez manuscripts about this community, because it is so rare that you have an African community in early modern Europe that is writing documents in its own language, right, for itself. So like there's, the European bias, let's say the European interpretation is kind of missing. It's really like them writing for themselves, right, in their own language. And I was like, well, something's got to be done with this, right? We could learn about this community in their own voice. But it was such a huge project. I mean, to understand the kinds of regulations that they wrote, the officers that they elected, the collaborations that they did, a lot of intellectual collaborations with Europeans. I had to learn so much more about Ethiopian history, right? About its monastic practice, about its hagiographical texts, about the diplomatic relations that sometimes the pilgrims were asked to comment upon, about the performance of the Mass. I mean, it was a huge learning project. So it wasn't something I was going to be able to produce quickly, right? And I think it was there in the background for 10 years. And little by little, I would sort of learn more about this, learn more about that, and start to be able to piece it together. In the meantime, I was writing articles on more, let's say, bounded subjects, right? Like particular episodes, usually, which was easier to do because the kind of context that I needed on both the European side or the Ethiopian side was doable, right? It was more limited. And sometimes, honestly, I was just asked to write articles for collected volumes, usually European collected volumes. So, tell us how the Ethiopians fit into heresy. Tell us how the Ethiopians fit into knowledge of languages in Renaissance Italy. So those are more about European reception, because that's what the editors wanted me to do.
Right. So in a chapter in your companion book, the chapter Medieval Ethiopia Diasporas, you sort of focus on three distinct types of medieval Ethiopians, Christians, Muslims, and enslaved Ethiopians from abroad. And I'm sort of wondering what sort of key insights emerged from your research, perhaps some that weren't as obvious to scholars prior to that.
Yeah, so I thought of that as, I mean, as you know, most of the contributors to that volume are like just like absolute leaders in their field, right? They've been doing this their whole career. And I was like, well, what can I contribute really? I mean, besides, putting it together and showcasing their work. So I thought, well, diaspora communities is something I've been doing some research on. My research is really only on the Christian diaspora in Europe, but there are others. And one of the aims of the book was to showcase that Ethiopia has a lot of different communities, and it did, from the 7th century to the 16th century, which is the period we cover. So to like acknowledge and document Muslim Ethiopians and what we call local religious Ethiopians, so people who were neither Muslim nor Christian. And I thought, well, no one has ever. There are different kind of scholarly traditions about these different groups, but I don't think anyone's ever kind of put them together in one place and thought about, well, what does Ethiopian diaspora look like in general in this period, right? If you just think about everybody. So that's what I tried to do. It wasn't really original research. It was mostly, this is what the volume was supposed to be in general, kind of like state of the art, right? Putting together what other scholars had done in these different areas. But I'd like to think that one of the insights that can be taken from it is that the borders between these, let's say, different faith groups could be pretty fluid or blurry. So in Egypt, for instance, there were Muslim Ethiopians, community of Muslim Ethiopians. There were communities of Christian Ethiopians in Cairo, in the Wadi al-Natrun, in Qusqlam. And there were enslaved Ethiopians who were brought there and sold. Often, if they're sold to Muslims, of course, they'll be converted and then they become part of the Muslim community. But that's different from the like free Muslims, right? Who came on their own and studied, for instance, at the great school at the Mosque of Al-Azhar. So you actually have all of these communities in one place, and they're distinct from each other, but in some ways they're overlapping or they're interacting. Christian Ethiopians, of course, could also be captured and enslaved. I've always wondered, did the free Christians at these hostile monasteries in Egypt ever encounter fellow Christian Ethiopians who had been captured and enslaved? Did they try to redeem them? I don't have any evidence that this happened, but I wouldn't be surprised if it did, right? But it, and also that sometimes similar motives, Ethiopian Christians often voluntarily traveled abroad for religious reasons, for pilgrimage. Muslim Ethiopians often traveled abroad to study, again, for basically religious reasons. So there are like parallels, there are overlaps. It can take you to the like whole range of places that Ethiopians were going, from India to Western Europe. So I liked that big frame, I guess, and some of the kind of generative comparisons maybe that could come out of that.
Right. And how valuable has it been to sort of collaborate with Ethiopian scholars? I know you've attended a couple conferences. Is that I know you sort of touched on this in regards to how valuable it was with Italian scholars, but is any distinction there? Was it useful to speak to Ethiopians about this? I imagine it was to a degree, but how much?
Oh, well, this book could not have been written without Ethiopian and Eritrean experts who were willing to share their insight with me. No question. I mean, also, scholars of Ethiopia who aren't of Ethiopian or Eritrean descent, but particularly when it came to things like the Mass or, theological debates, views on particular theological, sometimes practical issues. I think it's hard as someone who is not raised in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition for me to really understand what that is. And I am absolutely indebted to, Hapta Michael Kidane and Mahari Wurku, who, I would say, look, this is what I found in the manuscripts.
I mean,
What do you think?
I should mention it's very embarrassing for me as an Ethiopian to hear you say those names better than I can. Um, it's so it's remarkable that you could say them that well. So yeah, so you have the two Johanneses of Santo Stefano, and you sort of covered the biographies of two important Ethiopian pilgrims in the 15th century, and I'm wondering how sort of having to deal with multilingual work poses a challenge in your field of study, especially in medieval history and Ethiopian history specifically.
Like, how challenging was it for me to deal with Giz documents? Oh yeah, challenging. I started studying Giz 10 years ago, and I can't just like easily skim through a text. I sit down with a dictionary and I translate and I struggle and I ask for help. So it's not, there are many people who are more gifted than languages with me and probably don't have as hard a time with it. But yeah, that's a challenge for sure. And sometimes, like, I can understand literally what it's saying, but I need someone who's really like fully versed in Giz, right? Someone who is a deacon in the church, for instance, and also like knows all the biblical references that I'm not getting, to say, oh, it's that literal reading is not is not correct. It's this. And that's fine. I think I'm never going to be as good at Giz as Ethiopian Orthodox are, who like have studied this tradition their whole lives. And that's fine. That's what collaboration is for, I hope, right? We all bring different expertise and we work together, and hopefully together we are able to do something that neither of us would have been able to do alone.
And was it pivotal to know as for the work that you were doing in terms of studying these pilgrims?
For me, yes. I mean, there are people who work on Ethiopian-European relations who
And
don't, necessarily read Giz sources in the original. And, there's stuff in translation. There's a lot you can do with European sources alone. But for me, I knew from the beginning that this was something that I wanted to do. I just felt like I wouldn't even, there would be research questions I wouldn't even know to ask if I wasn't reading those documents myself. And that's true, that happened, right? I'm just like going through, I don't know, their inventory or one of the donations or whatever it is, and I think, oh, right, it like a little light bulb goes off in my mind. That maybe wouldn't have happened if I was only dealing with the European sources. So I have a chapter in the book that's on hagiography. Really, it's these two pilgrims are in Pisa. They're going on a secondary pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, and they stop in this monastery. And the Dominican friars at this monastery, they're there for 6 weeks. They're waiting for a ship, so they're there for 6 weeks. And Dominicans there are very curious. So they're asking them a lot of questions about Ethiopia, and particularly about monasticism and saints in Ethiopia. I would never have been able to write that chapter and to document how much genuine Ethiopian hagiographical tradition they conveyed if I weren't able to access those texts.
right. And
It
so
wouldn't be impossible.
it's vital to, yeah. So again, it's just the sort of addition of those perspectives, both a European and an Ethiopian one, and then adding on top of that the ability to understand the language. I think it's phenomenal. It says a lot about sort of the length someone is willing to go for their work, and that's remarkable. So you've given a lecture, Ethiopian in the Global Middle Ages, and I'm wondering what sort of the importance of cross-regional comparative work for the field of Ethiopian history is in your mind. Why is it important to take this wider lens view?
So as someone who is coming to it with a training in medieval Europe, the value that I see on that side, let's say for people who work on medieval or early modern Europe, is we're not always the center of everything that's going on. It's not always Europeans who are, making the discoveries and creating the innovations. Especially from a Christian point of view, we should probably all be thinking about Jerusalem as actually the center for everybody. And Ethiopia has its own relationship to that center. Europe has its own relationship to that center. From an Ethiopian point of view, Western Europe is a periphery, a pretty far periphery. I mean, it's got some good things, right? It's got some apostolic saints. I think this was a big draw. But Europeans were not always the protagonists, and things can look pretty different if you take the vantage of other people and approach them as they saw themselves, right? They were the protagonist. On the Ethiopian side, what does it have to gain? I mean, I think the most important thing for Ethiopian history is to look at the history within Ethiopia, right? There's very rich. There's certainly still a lot that we can learn there about this early period. I think everyone's aware that Ethiopia was, in constant contact with its neighbors from antiquity forward, and was both, like translating texts and traditions that are coming in from Egypt and Syria and other places, and also producing original literature that also goes back out and affects those other places. So that's not a new discovery, I would say, for Ethiopianists. I think everyone's quite aware of that. Maybe I like the idea that it can give a longer history to the phenomenon of Ethiopian diasporic settlement, right? That all the Ethiopian diasporic communities that exist today, that's part of a tradition that goes back, 2,000 years probably. And there were forebears who were doing this and struggling with dealing with foreign communities that are maybe kind of tolerant and maybe kind of not, having to adapt, but also, retaining your own culture and retaining links to the homeland. So that's one thing I like about it. And also, really just kind of foregrounding that Ethiopians were very adventurous and they traveled all over the place and, in a way, like a very, very cosmopolitan culture.
Right. Right. I think that's a really good framing. Are there any sort of new research perspectives you think taking that wider lens might allow people to see? Things that sort of historical research that hasn't been done in a way in the past, partly because there hasn't been that enlarged frame.
Well, I guess we'll see what develops. I'm working right now on a project on Ethiopian apocalyptic thought. And there's a lot about apocalyptic thought in Europe. There's a lot about apocalyptic thought in late antiquity and the way it spreads in multiple directions. And there is some work on this in Ethiopia too. But I feel like there's more that can be done to not only demonstrate that Christian Ethiopia was like 100% part of this very broad phenomenon of, different writers kind of foretelling what would happen in the last days, but that it had, Ethiopia had a particular take on what that would look like, right? What the end times would look like and the kind of final piece, right, before the last judgment, that I think really played a role in its quote unquote foreign relations for a long time. So I think that might give take a familiar subject and just give us a kind of different perspective on, how does this look when you're coming at it from this particular location and this cultural tradition?
Interesting. I didn't realize there was that much apocalyptic thought in Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
you do dig deeper into that. So your upcoming book sort of dives a little bit into sort of the Ethiopian community in early Rome. Um, I know it's not out yet.
It is out.
Is it out? Is today the day that it?
March 5th it came out, so I actually have a copy now.
Well, it'll be linked down below. Absolutely. Can you give us a little bit of insight into sort of what the key research questions behind that was, and how Ethiopia links into Rome, and yeah, sort of a general overview of that.
Absolutely. So, like I mentioned, very early on, I became interested in this community because we have all of these manuscripts, or I could hopefully find out something about them in their own words. But also because, being an Ethiopian Orthodox community in 16th century Rome is kind of a tricky proposition. This is a period when religious belonging is like a very volatile subject, right? We have the forced conversion and expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, from Portugal in 1497. Then we have Luther and the split right between Protestants and Catholics, and war, massacres, public massacres. So the Ethiopian pilgrims who come to Rome, they're fellow Christians, but they're not Catholics. And what is that like for them, right? How do they negotiate that, and how are they received? So the two kind of big subjects that I deal with is first, just documenting the community, right? Just like writing them back in to the history of Rome and of Europe in this period. So drawing on their Gez documents to try and identify, like, who are they? Where do they come from? What's their status, right? They're monks, some are priests, some are deacons. They come from all different provinces. Sometimes they tell us a little bit about their background, which particular monastery they're from, or what offices they held there, how many they were at Santo Stefano in different periods, and also how they organized themselves. So we have a lot of regulations that they wrote, right, just for the community. We know who their elected officers were, like what their titles were, and sometimes their names. We know the kind of regulations that they agreed upon for their community. And it turns out that all of that is like 100% Ethiopian. So they're recreating a traditional Ethiopian community in the heart of Catholicism. And I think from an Ethiopian point of view, that's not that surprising, because they had already created hostile monasteries like this in Jerusalem and Egypt and other places, right? So for them, that's completely normal. Then you move on to another pilgrimage destination, Rome, right? Apostolic saints, Peter and Paul, have their remains there. There's no reason an Ethiopian wouldn't be interested in going. And they just create the same kind of community that they've created before. We have no documents about when Santo Stefano was founded as an Ethiopian community, or by whom. But if you look at their organization, it's clear that, I mean, to me, it must have been their initiative. Because it's not like a Catholic institution, right? For everything about it is absolutely following the Ethiopian model. Which also raises the question, why did the popes allow this? I mean, their church is on Vatican property. They receive their food and drink from the papal household. But for the first 50 years, until the middle of the 16th century, they do this, right? They create their community, and they're allowed to. I think the popes were kind of like, let's not look too closely. If we look too closely, we might have to acknowledge that they're not actually Catholic. But the popes really wanted Ethiopia to join in union, right? And I think they hoped that if they were welcoming to this community, the community would sort of help make that bridge back to Ethiopia and to the Negus, but also that they could kind of imply that Ethiopia had already joined in union, and that was very good for the Pope's reputation, right? Because they like to think of themselves as the world leaders of Christianity. So that's one part, just like dealing with their own documentation and kind of what was this community like, how many, how organized, how did they manage it? And then the other part is um, their intellectual contributions. So they did a whole bunch of collaborations with European scholars mostly, right? Um, and like the one I told you about in Pisa, where they're telling them about all these Ethiopian saints' lives. There are a whole bunch of these, like at least a dozen of these in the first half of the 16th century. So this is Santo Stefano is like a major center for Europeans for Ethiopian knowledge. And until the Jesuits go to Ethiopia in the later 16th century and can kind of gather a lot of information on their own, these pilgrims are like a major source of information about everything, language, right? They teach Giz to a whole bunch of people, one of whom writes the first printed grammar of Giz. They publish the Mass ritual, the Psalter, right? They talk to different scholars about history, government, geography, all kinds of subjects. So I'm really interested in these because it's Ethiopian monks who are, of course, very learned, right? The kind of like keepers of the whole written tradition and sacred tradition. And they're teachers. They come to Europe and they try and instruct people who don't know that much about Ethiopia, all about its culture and particularly about its Christianity. So I think that's just a point that people need to know, especially because a lot of these collaborations were Ethiopian pilgrims speaking orally, and it was their European collaborators who were writing it down, right? So there's been sort of a tendency, let's say, for people to treat those as European authored works. Sometimes it's true that what you get in the work is a lot of European misconception and projection and assumptions. Ethiopia is the land of Prester John. Ethiopia is one of the Indies. Ethiopia has the tomb of St. Thomas. All these ideas that they had that are wrong, that still come through in those works. But what surprised me was how much like genuine Ethiopian tradition they were able to communicate. And I think that both of those things are really important. Because if Santo Stefano is, as people have said, like the place where Ethiopian studies as we know them today were born, then both of those things are part of that tradition. Genuine Ethiopian expertise that pilgrims are able to communicate and sometimes successfully communicate, but also the European misunderstandings and misconceptions and kind of projections that get put on that knowledge. I think both of those things together are like the tradition of European knowledge about Ethiopia. So I really tried to disentangle in, I don't know, 4 or 5 case studies, how that happened.
Wow, that's pretty deep, and that's I'm definitely gonna need to read that. There's a rigor to your work that I can so deeply appreciate. And so switching gears just a little bit, in addition to being an extremely incredible historian and writer, you're also a professor. And so I'm wondering like how do you go about teaching something like medieval Ethiopian history to your students at the perhaps undergrad and graduate level?
Well, I'm sorry to say that I have proposed to my department to teach a course specifically on Ethiopia, and I was shot down. I was told that there wouldn't be sufficient interest. I don't think this is true, and I'm going to try again. But the closest that I've been able to come so far is I teach the African history survey from kind of the beginnings of humanity to the 16th century. That's actually been a great learning experience for me because I had to learn a lot more about other parts of Africa that I didn't know so well. So North Africa I knew pretty well because, as you know, I did a minor in Islamic history. But West Africa, for instance, or Southeast Africa, the Swahili coast, right? All of this was stuff that um, I learned more about, and it's been great. Like, absolutely love it. Have loved learning about it. Love teaching this course, and not surprisingly, Ethiopia figures in there pretty vague. It's one of the places where you have some great primary source documents, like written by Ethiopians, Muslim and Christian, that students can read. The other big place we can do that is in West Africa with the Sonjata epic. And so even though it's a survey level class, I have the students kind of read these accounts written by Africans, and often usually in conjunction with outsider sources. So people who might be from Africa, like North Africa, or might be from somewhere else nearby, but are not from these societies, and how they describe and view these cultures. And my students love it. Like, it's not easy, right? You're dealing with societies that might be very, very unfamiliar to them, and they just the ability to like grapple with the sources written by Africans and their view of their own history. Like they often tell me in the like student evaluations that was one of their favorite parts of the course. So that's like really inspiring to me. I feel like there's a hunger to learn more about earlier African history, like let's say pre-colonial, right? And there are the sources to do it, not only written sources, of course, archaeological sources, artistic sources, historical linguistics, tracing the language. There's lots of ways that you can do it. And I think there really is a lot of interest, and I love being able to help students kind of get a foothold in that and realize like there's so much there, and you can do this, you can access this.
Right. Well, we need to rally people at Rutgers, see if we could get this Ethiopian class. So you've been a doctoral advisor as well for multiple students. I'm wondering how do you manage that type of relationship, and how do you best sort of try to guide somebody's future intellectual development?
Um, Often students come in with an idea, sometimes more precise, sometimes less precise, about what they're interested in studying. And that was also true for me. Mine was sort of less precise, let's say, but a general idea of what I wanted to do, right? Heresy in Italy, please find me a topic. So I think part of our job as advisors is to help students kind of focus that interest, right? Find a manageable topic in which they can, it's going to reflect their passion. It's going to get at the issues they want to get at, but it's going to be doable in 300 pages and 5 years, really 3 years that you focus on the dissertation itself. Part of it is helping them with the historiography. I feel like that's a big job that we do as advisors, is hopefully, we've read a lot and we don't necessarily know everything, but we know where to point students to find out more about it. And just, I think just being encouraging and, reading, giving feedback, just kind of being a sounding board the whole way. Every student has to find their own way through it, but it's our job to kind of be there with them while they're doing it, and kind of, if we know a little bit more, just help point them in the right direction.
Right. And I imagine it's a very rewarding experience, right?
That's great.
Being somebody's intellectual godfather, godmother. And one of the things that I'm wondering is, in doing all this research and having focused on history for as long as you have in life, are there any sort of core ideas, or any like core values that the assessment of history has given you? Things that perhaps an ordinary person might not filter through in their day-to-day life, but that's very core to you as a person.
I feel like one of the main things that studying history has helped develop in me is a willingness to try and enter into perspectives other than my own. And that can be, cultural or chronological, right? People who lived in cultures very different from mine, but also maybe just lived in a period in which things were quite different from the way they are now. So that kind of empathy, to try and enter into it, to try and see it from that perspective, I think is just useful for humans in general. And I guess the other one that's been particularly important in the years that I've been working on Ethiopian history is having some humility about the extent of your own knowledge and recognizing that probably no person really knows everything. And it's a good idea to kind of stop and check your own assumptions and to seek out input and expertise from others that can maybe, correct misconceptions or assumptions, maybe leaps that you've made unconsciously. Something seems familiar to you, so you think it's like X or Y, but maybe that's wrong in terms of the culture that you're looking at. So I guess I would say those are two repeated experiences that I've had as a historian that I think are just useful for human beings in general.
Right. I sort of a beautiful world to me, a beautiful future world to me is one where we are continuously learning history about all things everywhere as much as we can. What's sort of like a guidebook you would give to an amateur historian who doesn't have perhaps the time to give their entire life to history, but is interested enough to want to learn history about different parts of the world?
Or like a global history, something that would cover everything?
Yeah, something that's not so local that they're focused on just the things that would interest them in their community, but something that's more global, that takes more of a entire planetary view.
That's hard to say. I think there's a real value in the local too.
Agreed.
Um, Sometimes when we take too broad a canvas, it can kind of flatten the individuality and the particularities of different societies. And those particularities are really important. So I think any good history book that can give you a deep dive into one culture is going to be hugely valuable for your view of all cultures, right? Because it will kind of give you a sense of, wow, it's not what I'm used to, right? That's not how my society is organized. Those aren't like the prevailing values or power structures that we have. So here's a completely different way that a society could organize itself. And I think that in itself kind of just like really opens up, right? And it could be any society. Maybe better if it's not your own society. But maybe also, it can be. You go back 200 years or 600 years in the society that you identify with and are like, wow, that wasn't what I expected. So that would be my suggestion, I guess. Try and find a good book on some part of the world or some culture in some time period that you don't actually know anything about. And if it's well done, it'll just open up one new world for you.
Interesting. So you're of the opinion that you should pick something local, go in depth, and then slowly expand from there. Um,
Yeah, yeah, I would say so.
seems very reasonable. For somebody that's young, that's maybe where you were when you were starting out your career, what would you say for somebody that wanted to actually become a professional historian and actually wanted to become, probably will never be a Professor Samantha Kelly, but would like to at least aspire to that ideal?
Like what steps to take?
A young woman in your position, couple years ago.
Um, Ask for advice. Don't be shy. Find somebody who specializes in the thing that you're interested in and send them an email, call them up, ask for a meeting if they're local and pick their brain, right? I would like to do this. How can I go about it? What should I read? What languages do I need? What courses maybe should I be taking that I haven't taken already? That's what I did. That's the only way that I knew what to do to get into graduate school. I see this in my students A lot. Also, they're just kind of shy about approaching professors. Like they don't have the right, or they're imposing in some way. Obviously, you are not like this. It's one of the things that I love about you. You have your curiosity and you go out there and you write to people, and that's a great thing to do. None of us can do it all on our own, right? So um, draw on the expertise of others, right? Ask for their help, get their guidance. Ultimately, though, it has to be every person's choice. Like someone might say to you, oh, this is a great topic because people haven't written on this. If you're not interested in it, don't do it, because it's your time, right? And it's your life. And it has to be something that you really enjoy doing and feel like you're getting something out of, or there's no point in doing it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And sort of just closing up a little bit, are there any values and principles that you as a person adhere to that you think a lot of young people would benefit if they adopted as values and principles of their own?
Wow, I feel like that would be really presumptuous of me to feel that I had values and principles that others should emulate.
It doesn't need to seem presumptuous. I think it could be generic in the sense that they'd be they'd be well served if they adopted them, especially in the world we live in today.
So I would say one thing that I have really enjoyed in my career, I don't know if it's the best advice for everybody, but follow your curiosity. Don't be afraid of your ignorance, because we're all ignorant at the beginning, right, of whatever we end up working on. And that can change over time. I feel like I'm on at least change 3 now in my career. Went from American studies to medieval Europe to Ethiopian studies. You're never too old to try something new, and your curiosity, or maybe even passion, can take you places that you wouldn't have expected, and that can make for a great life.
Absolutely. Probably something that we lack in the amounts that might be necessary for an even better world. Curiosity. I think it'd be better served with a little bit more of it. Um, so this is my last question, a question that I like to ask all my guests, and it's what, in your perspective, is the most valuable idea on the planet right now?
This is where you should have given me questions in advance, Daniel, so I could like reflect on it for a week.
Right.
The most valuable idea for the planet?
On the planet right now, in your perspective. It's completely subjective.
Empathy. I feel like there's a lot of divisions, a lot of tendency to see other people as not just different, but really an enemy and a threat. And I feel like if we tried a little bit harder to walk in someone else's shoes and see it from their perspective, we could avoid a lot of problems and a lot of violence.
That's as good as ideas get. Um, Professor Dr. Samantha Kelly, this has been extremely insightful for me, a true honor to have this opportunity to sit with you and cover some of your phenomenal life. Definitely not, I mean, this could go on for hours and hours if we were to cover your entire life and work, but this has been extremely intriguing and I've learned a tremendous amount. And I want to appreciate you for taking the time out of your very valuable Sunday afternoon to join me.
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk with you, Daniel, and thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely.